he'll talk about the ecology of different species and where they're found in pollard trees. Over to you, Jim.
Thank you so much. What an introduction, and what an amazing range of talks this morning. I'm so privileged to be here, so thanks for having me. Where are we? Is this working? Here we go. So my name's Jim, and there's two things you need to know about me. I like bats and I like trees. And when you get bats in trees, that's when I get particularly excited. And would you know it, that's what I'm talking about today. Aren't we lucky? Fantastic. When Helen contacted me originally, she asked if I knew anybody who worked on bats in pollards. And I had to say no, because I think, like so many species groups, bats are understudied. We know a little bit about them, but I don't know anyone particularly working on bats in pollards, so I'm going to be talking primarily about bats in trees, which hopefully will have some applications to pollards as well. So in the UK, we have 18 different bat species, and 14 of them live in trees. And according to the Bat Tree Habitat Key, it's a fantastic little book, green book called Bat Roosts in Trees, they described 19 different types of features that bats use in trees, and they're separated into different categories. So disease and decay, generally speaking, these are features that take some time to develop. So part of the tree dies, it may decay away slowly, and then you get that growth afterwards, maybe woundwood growing over that. So you get one area retreating and one area advancing, and that area in between is particularly useful to bats. We have the damage category, which are typically much faster to form. So we're thinking things like splits and cracks here. So we get a severe storm, and that can open up a split or a crack. And then the final category is association, and the one in this one is called fluting. So we're thinking about certain tree species here. So in the UK, our native tree species would be beech and yew. So it's that undulated adaptive growth, typically seen low down on the stem, that essentially folds in on itself. So there's no damage, there's no decay, but it just folds in and creates a little pocket that bats can use. And we can separate bat species out into two broad camps. So on the left-hand side, we can describe those species that like crevices or tight spaces. So they tuck themselves up, maybe underneath lifting bark. An example is the barbastelle bat, Barbastella barbastellus. Then we have the other end of the spectrum, the species that like voids, like woodpecker holes, as we've just heard. And an example that loves woodpeckers is our Bechstein's bat, Myotis bechsteini. And then we have some bat species that aren't really fussy at all. So like our nocturnal bat, they're happy in either. And I'm going to talk about these three bat species today. We've only got 15 minutes, there's not enough time to cover all of our bat species, but these are our bat species that primarily roost in trees. So starting off with barbastelle then, if you look in all the research, it talks about them living underneath lifting bark. And I find them time and time again, quite often in dense woodland, quite often a dead oak tree with areas of lifting bark peeling off like this. And it's an interesting life strategy, this, because of all of the features that bats use in trees, this is one of the shortest lived. Now, no tree roost is going to last forever, but these may only last a few years. And this is recognized by the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, that talks about the loss of mature trees, in particular bark, as being a particular threat to this species. And I have first-hand experience of this. So this is from some research that we were doing last year where we put a radio tag on the bat, find out where it goes. And we tracked it to this oak tree, and there was one piece of bark remaining on that oak tree. And quite often what happens with this species is it follows the tide of lifting bark, and it will move around the tree as more pieces of the bark eventually fall off. And you can see the group of bats tucked in underneath here, and the body warmth they're giving off, so the mothers are coming out to feed, and at the very end it leaves a small ball of heat, and that's the babies left in behind there. And you might think there's not a fantastic place to live this, is it? Because they're losing a lot of heat to the environment. But as you saw from the previous photo, this tree benefits from being in the open. So when it's a sunny day, admittedly not very often in the UK, although we're doing okay today, they can benefit from warming up in that sense. However, I went back this year, we revisited the same tree, and less than 12 months later, that final piece of bark had come off the tree, so we can wave goodbye to that Barbastelle maternity roost that was in that tree. Hopefully, they will find elsewhere to go on site. And it's not just natural degradation that causes this. So this is a tree I found in a similar study a few years before, 2017, and the bats again, on sweet chestnut this time, the bats were beneath the lifting bark. Barbastelle, quite a fan of an exit strategy, so you can see them coming out the centre a bit, but the final bat's not happy with that, so she ducks out the left-hand side in a second, because they like to have more than one exit point, presumably to avoid predation. However, a few years later, the landowner came along and decided to do some work on the tree and the surrounding environment. And this was under the guise, this is public money for a deer park restoration. Not great, is it? And because of how delicate that feature is, the bats were roosting just down here, but you can see strips of bark ripped off the tree during that process. We can wave goodbye to the bats in that tree as well. And it seems a really odd strategy, this. This bat in particular chooses lifting bark to roost beneath. But it's in a huge number of research projects. And it really got me thinking, because when I first started working with bats, these were described as woodland bats. But when you track them on an evening, the first thing they do is fly straight out of the woodland and go to feed elsewhere. So I thought, well, why is that? They can't be woodland bats if they're leaving the woodland. And I think the reality is they're tree bats. And of course, where do we have most of our trees? And certainly our trees that are allowed to develop these types of features, they're away from people. They're in woodlands. They're in inaccessible areas where they're not managed. This is from Savanac Forests, some work I was doing last year. And it turns out they do have good taste. If you give them the right trees, they will make the right decisions, as you can see from this amazing oak tree, but also in this amazing beech tree as well. And this comes back to what Miguel mentioned earlier on about the changing landscapes and grazing or lack of grazing. And what we think we know about bats in trees is perhaps based on a biased data set, because most of our nature reserves are woodlands, so we radio track bats from woodlands. So where do they end up roosting? Oh, in the woodlands. But when you actually have sites with these amazing trees, we find them in those as well. And this is one in the central decay of an old tree. You can see there in the cubicle rot, just tucked away. This bat is often described as hiding in plain sight. If you think about the fight or flight spectrum, when you have adrenaline, whether you run away or whether you dig in and fight, these bats are definitely on the flight end of the spectrum. And when I was first researching them, we would find them in bat boxes. And you had to be very careful putting a ladder up against the tree, because if you made too much noise, they were gone. Up next then, our Bechstein's bat. So a species that likes voids, and in particular, hugely associated with woodpecker holes. And we've just heard about the amazing work that woodpeckers do as ecosystem engineers. And you can see from this video, the bats are descending down from the top of the hole. And Chris was kind of asking a question about the aeration of that central wood, the decay that follows maybe the excavation of the nest cavity. And for a long time, people thought the bats only roosted above the entrance, as you can see in this video here. But we know that's not the case. Actually, they're quite happily down below the entrance, and in woodpecker holes, you can find them roosting quite happily just as the bird excavated it. And have a look at how the bats are hanging. They're hanging around the side of the cavity, and they're facing downwards. We'll contrast that in a second to a different bat species. But bats in trees are really difficult to study. And that's because they move so frequently, maybe every 3 to 4 days, and they can use up to 50 trees in a year. And we never really understood why until I started recording this type of footage, where I realized, well, if the bats were in that feature at the time the stoat visited, there'd be no more bats, would there? So clearly they need to move to stay ahead of the predators, and it's not just stoats. Sorry. On this one here, when I first saw the video, I saw that it was -9 degrees, and I thought, well, maybe the ground is frozen and the stoats are being sent up into the tree, because this is unusual behavior, right? And then I had to remind myself, I've only ever seen 2 stoats in my life, and they were both crossing the road. We just don't see them that often, do we? And as I started looking at more photos and videos from the cameras, we were finding them time and time again, visiting cavities periodically throughout the year. So all of the cavities in trees were being visited by this predator. But it's not just stoats. You can see this feature that's a long, narrow slit. And when I first found this tree, there were 2 bats in it. On this evening, there's video after photo after photo after photo of bats coming back in. It's so crammed that they have to occupy the space next to the entrance. And then, sure enough, a tawny owl gets wind of this and tries to get an easy lunch. And increasingly, we're finding this species, again, a species that when I started studying bats, people thought was a woodland bat, in much more open environments. So this is a knothole on a lime tree in a parkland setting. Just a single male bat there, visible from the ground with a high-power camera. There's also lots of research to show that they turn up in orchard trees. And orchard trees are fantastic because you've got that abundance of flowers in the spring, you've got the fruit in the autumn, so you've got food coming to you. Why would you go elsewhere? And in similarity to pollards, of course, we have trees that are pruned on a regular basis, and as we know, pruning trees will speed up the process of decay forming in the center of stems and branches, etc. Now, despite both of these bat species being tree specialists during the summer months, they're wimps. And when it gets really cold, they head underground. So they can stay in the trees maybe until December, but come January and February, most of these bats will head underground. And in part, I think that's linked to how they mate. There's different strategies that bats use for mating. These 2 are promiscuous. What you're looking at here is the equivalent of a bat disco. So the males know the females will turn up in the autumn, so they just come and harass them and try to mate as many times as possible in this phenomenon known as autumn swarming that happens 3 to 4 hours after sunset. And then they spend the winter in these nice stable conditions underground, so caves, mines, but human-made things such as quarries, tunnels, cellars as well. And then we get onto the really hardcore bats. So we heard about the nocturnal earlier on. It's happy in either void or crevice. So you can see nocturnal bats, or can you see? Maybe you can't see. Nocturnal are specialists of woodpecker holes again. And they're one of our biggest bat species. They're really aggressive, and they come out really early on. So you quite often see that changeover of birds, insectivorous birds like swallows, house martins, swifts, going in to roost for the night, and the nocturnal bats heading out. And similar to the Bechstein's bats, they're happy to roost below the entrance in woodpecker holes. But look how they're positioned. They're just sat in the bottom of that hole looking up at me going, yeah, what are you going to do? They have such self-confidence, these bats. They honestly don't give a shit whenever I climb a tree and have a look in them. And in this video here, again, not only below, but to the side of the entrance, just look at me. Oh, it's this guy again. He's back. Very calm bat. And as you might imagine, there's lots of competition for cavities in trees. There's an increasing number of papers finding bats, in particular nocturnal bats, cohabiting with other species. So there's a paper that shows that starlings can have their young alongside nocturnal bats. There's a paper that talks about 2 species of bat, the Dorbenton's bat and the nocturnal bat cohabiting. And in this series of photographs here, during the night, we can see the Dorbenton's bats returning. During the day, then there's bees turning up in the same feature. And the following day, it's Dorbenton's bats and nocturnal bats coming together. Whether they're sharing the same space inside the cavity, I don't know. Some of the papers on Dorbenton's bats and nocturnal bats show that they roost separately. Some of them show that they roost together. And they're increasingly being found in areas where there's grey squirrel or ringneck parakeet. which provide competition for cavities in the UK. So those are the void features, but I mentioned they're also happy in the crevice-type features. So this is a crack that a nocturnal bat was tucked away in to see the winter out. And I mentioned that they hibernate in trees. They're really hardy bats. And we can look at the biology, the physiology of this species, and they can tolerate a really wide range of temperatures. So for the maternity roost, where the females gather together to give birth to their young, they can go anywhere between 17 to 26 degrees C. And the idea is that the warmer the better, because that means everything is much faster, the development of the young. But come the winter, they can tolerate really cold conditions as well. And the skin temperature of a nocturnal bat can be as low as -9 degrees without it having any problems. If below that, it wakes up more frequently. And if they roost together, if they gather together like penguins on the ice, they can tolerate much lower air temperatures because it means they're benefiting from the insulation that each other provide. So they can tolerate down to -16 degrees. And one of the reasons we see this difference in whether they stay all year in the tree is down to the mating. So I talked earlier on about the bat disco that the Beckstein's bats and the Barberstales partake in. This is a male nocturnal bat setting up his territory. You may have noticed him rubbing his neck, his glands, to make it just smell just right around the entrance. This is him singing. This is what a bat singing looks like. And is he going to be successful, I wonder? Oh, there we go. So he'll keep on singing, and he'll have a harem of females behind him, which he then defends over the winter months, and he'll be present right by the entrance of that hole to stop anything else coming into it. This is that same bat, but it's earlier on in the season. Have a look at the time, so kind of end of July. And would you know it, he's turned back up at his favorite mating hole, only to find that there's a grey squirrel in it. Boo! But amazingly, that doesn't put him off. So he comes back, and the squirrel starts throwing some punches from inside the hole. We get a bit of a stalemate, and eventually the bat thinks, well, sod it, I'm going in. That squirrel is in a whole world of pain. Watch the face. There we go. Nothing quite like watching a grey squirrel in pain, is there? And what happened next was incredible. Grey squirrels, what, that big? Nocturnal bats. When I started bat work, to give people an idea of how big a nocturnal bat was, I used to say a Mars bar with a decent-sized bite taken out of it. They keep making chocolate bars smaller, so I think it's just a Mars bar now. I think they did that to help with my analogy. So the size of a Mars bar versus a grey squirrel. The following video, he comes out and he carries on singing. And he scared the great squirrel away. If you have any doubt, look at the time, the date, 23rd of July, 11 o'clock at night. A few hours later, there he is again, rubbing his neck around the entrance. He definitely won that fight. And it wasn't over there. The grey squirrel came back the following day, and they kept going at it. Great stuff. That was a whistle-stop tour. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Jim. That was fantastic. And I think if nothing this morning, we've really seen how interdependent all these sort of species and trees are, and how important our ancient trees are for all sorts of different things. It's a fascinating reminder of just what we have in all these different countries. Any questions for Jim? There must be one on about what I thought.
Thank you, Jim, for a fantastic talk and brilliant footage.
I thought you were going to beatbox then. Just introduce your question, lay down some beats.
Yeah. Next time.
Okay.
Birds who nest in holes normally only use the hole for 1 year due to probably parasites or something. Does bats have the same kind of behavioral pattern? Or can they use the same hole more than 1 year?
Because they don't create their own cavities, they are very loyal to where they roost. And I think also because these trees won't last forever, the cavities don't last forever, they need to have a network of sites that they can go to. We also see movement. So I mentioned about the bat species that live underground in the winter. They have to migrate from there to the summer roosts, and they have to stop over along the way. So they'll have trees they live in along the way. I've mainly showed you footage of maternity roosts where the female bats come together, but then males go off and do their own thing, so they'll have their own roosts. So we see all of these different roosts needed at different times of year. And this is one of the things I think that makes them so challenging to study, because if you're not looking in the right place at the right time of year, you won't find them. We know that if you visit one tree once, you have about a 5% likelihood of finding bats. So flip that round, 95% likely that they're elsewhere. So all of that mixed together makes it challenging. We know they are loyal, but we don't know a great deal about it. We do have some species that have parasites. They have flies that live on them, and the flies jump off, and then they live on the substrate of the cavity, and then they reappear the following year. And we know the larger the roost, so more animals, more parasites associated with that. But they are very, I guess birds groom themselves as well, but they're very big on grooming. I have lots of videos of bats waiting to leave the roost, and they're there just scratching themselves, licking the wings. They have a lot of self-care as well.
Fascinating. Another question? Yeah, Jill. Oh, just down through the centre.
Jim, I was going to ask you about frequency and distribution of these habitat features. Have you, can you give us some broad ideas? You've answered it partly, but...
Not really, no. It's not. It's because they are so challenging to study. They rely on tagging individual bats, and then you need that manual survey effort. So there are a few studies that look at the distribution and populations of an individual colony, but then trying to scale that up to landscapes is very challenging. There is a paper from Belgium that looks at the resource available in the woodland, and then the number of bats and where they move to, and that's where we get the 5% figure from. And the idea that they need somewhere between 40 and 50 trees a year.
Within what sort of scale of area?
So that's for Bechstein's bats. They typically go somewhere between 1 kilometre to 3 kilometres away from the roost. They could say quite close to the roost. But other species like the nocturnal bat that we saw range much further than that. The technology for larger bats has advanced now that they can put GPS tags on them, and they're seeing them migrate from Spain up through Germany. There was one this year actually that flew from France on a single evening, came to the UK to feed, and then flew back.
Wow.
So these kind of the scales we're working on. There's a species that's not, it does roost in trees, but is not a tree specialist, the Enthusiast pipistrelle, that migrates southwest to northeast. The largest straight line migration to date is from Russia to the UK, 2,000 kilometres in a straight line. And a bit like migrating birds, they must need staging posts along the way to be successful.
So I asked this question because what is a significant veteran characteristic? Is a single woodpecker hole significant enough to protect a veteran tree, or a single piece of loose bark or whatever? And it's a challenge, but it's not just a one-off occasion in losing, it's multiple species and over lots of years while that habitat is still there. So we need to really think about that quite carefully.
Absolutely, yeah.
It was great to see the nocturals see off that grey squirrel. But have you had any experience with the nocturals and the parakeets?
So I live in a part of the country where we don't have the parakeets. We're lucky, so I don't have first-hand experience. I know, having had conversations with David and Ali at Hampstead Heath, they kind of know it's an issue there. And undoubtedly, as I'm told, they're very aggressive birds. But yeah, I don't have any first-hand experience.
Okay, we had another question down here.
With apologies, it's not a question, it's just an observation, because I live near Hyde Park and witnessed the most amazing scene between squirrels and parakeets, because there are lots of parakeets in Hyde Park. And it must have been a parakeet nest that squirrels had invaded. And what particularly impressed me is that the parakeets came almost like squadrons. It started with just 2 parakeets trying to fight the squirrel. And by the time I left, there must have been about 12 or 15 parakeets, all, coming up as reinforcements to try and force this squirrel out. So just an observation there.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
I imagine as that species spreads, we may see the crevice-dwelling species doing slightly better, or not as bad, I guess, as the void-dwelling species, because they tuck themselves away. And then of the 3 species I've spoken about today, the nocturnal bats, the one that's happy in either, is the widest spread and the most common species, and would undoubtedly be able to switch from one to another, I imagine, and then being bigger and more aggressive, probably being helpful too.
Okay, one more, last question.
When you've got a situation like that, tree with one piece of bark, if you were really keen to try and preserve the habitat, if you've ever done anything like artificially replace that, so in anticipation of losing it completely, is there something you can put as a replacement to that bark?
There is. So they do adopt bat boxes quite easily, quite readily, and there was a similar tree to that when I first started working in that, when I was studying actually 20 odd years ago. They put carpet tiles up on a standing dead stem, and they moved into that. They put boxes next to it. They moved into that as well. There's an American company called Brandon Bark. I don't think you can buy it retail in the UK, but you can import it wholesale, that produce a bark-like substance that you can put on the tree that's longer lasting. I'm also involved in a project which is an offshoot of Vicky's, looking at veterinisation specifically for bats. And so there's other ways, multiple ways to skin a cat, I guess.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I worked on a reserve where they used carpet tiles to be able to move bats, to encourage them to move away from an area that had to be managed, if you see what I mean.
Bats like carpet.
Yeah, they do. They're obviously,
It's a take-home message.
Yeah, but it has to be Axminster, or it has to be certainly a wool carpet rather than a rubber carpet. Okay, thanks, Jim. Thank you very much.